There was a winter once, 300 years ago, when Europe froze. Not slowly, not with warning. Overnight. The morning of January 6th, 1709, arrived with a stillness no one had expected. People woke to find their world transformed. The air itself felt different, sharper, heavier somehow, as though something in the atmosphere had changed while they slept. William Derham, a clergyman near London who kept careful weather records, looked at his thermometer that morning and saw something he'd never seen before. -12 degrees Celsius, the lowest reading in 12 years of observation. He would later write that he believed the frost was greater than any other within the memory of man. And he was right. What followed was the coldest winter Europe had experienced in 500 years, maybe longer. A winter so severe that even now, centuries later, scientists cannot fully explain what happened. The atmospheric patterns don't match anything we understand about European weather. Something unusual was happening, they say. Something that shifted the normal order of things. But for the people living through it, there was no explanation at all. Just the cold. And then the realization, slowly dawning over days and weeks, that this cold was not going away. Let's go back to the night before. January 5th, 1709. Imagine a peasant village somewhere in the French countryside, perhaps in Burgundy, where the rolling hills would soon be buried under snow, or maybe Languedoc in the south, where people rarely worried about harsh winters. The day had been cold, certainly, but it was winter. Cold was expected. Families gathered in their small cottages that evening, as they always did. One room, maybe two if they were fortunate. Walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud and straw and dung. A thatched roof overhead, an earthen floor below. The central hearth would have been burning. Not a grand fireplace with a chimney. Those were for the wealthy. Just a fire pit surrounded by stones, the smoke drifting up through the room and escaping through a hole in the roof. The fire only retained about 15% of its heat, but it was something. It was light and warmth in the darkness. Children would have been huddled close to the fire, perhaps wrapped in layers of wool. The women might have been spinning or mending by the dim light. The men checking tools, preparing for the next day's work. Outside, he saw the livestock were settled in their portion of the house. Yes, the animals lived with the family. Chickens, perhaps a pig, maybe even a cow if the family was doing well. Their body heat helped warm the cottage. Their presence was familiar, ordinary. Everything seemed normal. The family would have banked the fire before sleep, burying a coal deep in the ashes to keep it alive through the night. If it went out, someone would have to walk to a neighbor's cottage in the morning to borrow fire. A small humiliation, but a common one. Then they slept. Under whatever blankets they had. Wool, mostly. Heavy and rarely washed because wet wool in freezing temperatures could turn into an icy shell, making movement nearly impossible. The house would have been drafty. Every crack stuffed with whatever they could find. Mud, straw, not more dung. Anything to keep the wind out. But nothing could have prepared them for what was coming. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, the temperature plummeted. Not gradually. suddenly. The cold arrived like something alive, sweeping across the continent from the Arctic, pushed by atmospheric forces no one understood. It crashed through villages and cities, through fields and forests, freezing everything it touched. When people woke on the morning of January 6th, their world had changed. The first thing they would have noticed was the silence. Birds, normally so vocal at dawn, were absent. Many had frozen mid-flight and fallen from the sky like stones. Their small bodies would be found later, scattered across the snow. The second thing was the cold itself. Not ordinary winter cold, something else entirely. The kind of cold that made your lungs hurt when you breathed, that made your fingers go numb, even inside thick wool mittens stuffed with moss and rabbit fur, that made your face ache. One woman, a duchess living in the palace at Versailles, would later write a letter describing how she sat next to a roaring fire, wrapped entirely in furs, and still could barely hold her pen to write. Her hands shook from the cold despite every precaution. If she felt that way in a palace, imagine what the peasants felt. In the villages, people emerged from their cottages to find their animals frozen in the stables. Chickens, stiff and cold. Pigs, dead despite the shelter. Cows that had survived every previous winter, gone. It must have been incomprehensible at first. Animals died in winter sometimes, yes, but not like this. Not all at once. Not when they were supposed to be protected. The wells were frozen solid. The rivers turned to ice so thick you could drive a wagon across them. In some places, the ice reached depths of more than a meter. Ships in harbors were trapped, their crews dying of cold and hunger as supplies ran out and rescue became impossible. Even the trees were dying. People reported hearing strange cracking sounds echoing through the forests, like invisible woodcutters working in the night. The sap inside the trees was freezing and expanding, and the trunks were splitting apart from the pressure. Whole orchards of fruit trees, olive groves in the south of France that had stood for generations, shattered in the cold. And the ground itself froze so deeply that when people died, it was nearly impossible to dig graves. The earth was hard as iron, more than a meter down. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with those first days, those first terrible realizations. A peasant family waking to find their careful preparations meaningless. The food they'd stored, the animals they'd raised, the fuel they'd gathered. None of it was enough. Not for this. The stored vegetables in the cellar, buried in sand to keep them fresh, were freezing. Cabbage, onions, turnips, the staples that would see them through to spring. The grain in the barn was at risk too. If moisture got in, it would freeze and spoil. And there was no way to get more. The roads were impassable. Snow piled high, then froze into immovable drifts. Even if you could travel, where would you go? Every village, every town, every city was facing the same crisis. The mills stopped working because the rivers were frozen. No flowing water meant no turning wheels, meant no grinding grain into flour. And bread was the foundation of everything. A peasant's diet was simple. Bread, dark and coarse, made from rye or barley. Porridge and stew that simmered over the fire for days, filled with whatever was available. Cabbage, beans, peas, maybe some cheese or milk. Meat was rare, saved for feast days or desperate times. all of that depended on grain. Without grain, there was no bread. Without bread, there was hunger. The cold didn't break. Days passed, then weeks, and the temperature stayed far below freezing. In Paris, on January 14th, the thermometer read -15 degrees Celsius. In the countryside, in places like Beauce, it dropped to -25, and it stayed there. Families huddled in their cottages, burning whatever they could find. Firewood, yes. But when that ran out, they burned furniture, fences, anything wooden. There are records of people stealing their neighbors' fences to feed their own fires. The smoke from the hearth would have been constant, filling the small rooms, making eyes water and throats burn. But stopping the fire meant freezing. At night, the family would have crowded together for warmth. Children in the middle, adults on the outside, trying to share body heat. Wool blankets piled on top, maybe straw mattresses, and maybe just straw on the floor. The animals that survived were brought even closer. Their warmth mattered more than ever. Sleep must have been difficult. The cold seeping through every gap. The constant worry about whether the fire would last, whether there would be enough fuel for tomorrow. And underneath it all, a growing dread. Because this wasn't getting better. Peasant life had always been hard. Most people spent their entire lives in the village where they were born, working the land, following the rhythms of the seasons, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, surviving in winter. They knew hardship. They knew hunger sometimes. They knew that a bad harvest could mean a difficult year. But this was different. This wasn't a failed harvest. This was nature itself turning hostile. And the social order that governed their lives, the feudal system that had shaped medieval society for centuries, offered no protection against this. They still owed labor to their lord. Days of work on the lord's land, maintaining roads, clearing forests, whatever was demanded. They still owed a tithe to the church, 1/10 of whatever they produced. They still had to pay fees for using the Lord's mill, the Lord's oven, the Lord's wine press. They still needed permission to marry, to move, to make almost any significant decision. And now, when survival itself was in question, those obligations didn't stop. Of course, in practice, when the snow is meters deep and the roads are impassable, and everyone is fighting to stay alive, some of those obligations became impossible to fulfill. But the system didn't change. The lords still had their castles, the clergy still had their churches, and the peasants still had their small cottages and their frozen fields. In the villages, people began to rely on each other in new ways. Medieval peasant communities had always been close-knit by necessity. You helped your neighbors with the harvest, with building repairs, with watching children. You shared tools and skills and labor. Now that cooperation became essential to survival. If one family's fire went out, they could get a coal from a neighbor. If someone found a patch of edible grass under the snow, the discovery was shared. If a family had a little extra food, even just a handful of dried beans, sharing it might mean the difference between someone living or dying. The village church became even more central, not just for Sunday services, though those continued. People gathered there for warmth when their own cottages became too cold. They prayed together. They sought comfort in the familiar rituals: baptisms, weddings, funerals. The markers of life continued, even as life became harder. The local priest might have been one of the few people in the village who could read and write. He might have had access to information from the wider world, news from other parishes, rumors of what was happening elsewhere, though the news, when it came, was rarely good. Across France, the situation was growing desperate. The country had already been struggling. Since 1701, France had been fighting in the War of the Spanish Succession. Wars are expensive. They require soldiers, which means taking men from farms and villages. They require supplies. They require money, which means taxes. The peasants had already been paying more than usual. The harvests in previous years had been poor. The burdens were already heavy. And then came the frost. King Louis XIV, ruling from Versailles, tried to respond. He organized distributions of bread. He required the aristocracy to do the same. He sent inspectors to register all grain stores, trying to prevent hoarding. Hoarding was punishable by hard labor in the galleys, or execution. Desperate times called for desperate measures. But it wasn't enough. When you've lost your crops, your livestock, your ability to plant for next year, when the mills aren't working and the roads are blocked and every village is in the same situation, government orders can't fix everything. The price of grain began to rise. From January 1708 to May 1709, prices increased sixfold in northern France. They doubled in the south. For a peasant family living on the edge, that kind of increase meant starvation. By February, violence began to break out, not just in France, across Europe. Between February and June of 1709, there were 155 recorded instances of open rebellion in France alone. Starving people attacked any building that might have food: castles, monasteries, granaries. Peasants who had been reduced to eating soup, made from ferns, from grass, from anything they could find, formed groups and raided bakeries. They ambushed grain convoys traveling on the roads. It wasn't organized revolution. It was desperation. When you watch your children starve, when you've exhausted every other option, when the social contract that was supposed to provide protection in exchange for labor has failed, what choice do you have? The authorities responded with force, of course. But how do you maintain order when everyone is hungry? When the soldiers trying to keep the peace are hungry too? Let's step back from the larger picture for a moment. Let's return to that single peasant family in their cottage. It's late February now. The frost has been gripping Europe for almost 2 months. The family's stores are running low. The vegetables they buried are gone, eaten, or spoiled. The grain is being rationed carefully. A handful a day, ground into rough flour if they can get to a working mill, or just boiled into porridge if they can't. There's almost no meat. The animals are dead. Hunting is nearly impossible in the deep snow. And even if you could hunt, the game animals are dying too. Wolves, driven by hunger, have been coming closer to the villages. There are reports of wolf attacks on livestock, on solitary travelers, even on people in their homes. The wolves have lost their fear. They're starving too. The family's days have fallen into a grim routine. Wake with the weak winter light. Bank the fire overnight has hopefully kept a coal alive. Add whatever fuel is available carefully, because fuel is running out. Eat a small meal. Porridge, maybe. Weak ale or watered wine, because you never drink water directly. Water carries disease. Then the work of survival. Check the cottage for new gaps where wind is getting in. Stuff them with whatever you can find. Check the remaining food. Make decisions about how much to use today. Venture outside if possible. Look for anything useful. Firewood under the snow, edible plants, signs of game. But mostly, stay inside. Stay together. Try to stay warm. The children, if they're young, don't understand why everything has changed, why there's not enough food, why it's always cold, why the adults are worried all the time. Older children understand better. They see the strain in their parents' faces. They feel the hunger too. By this point, malnutrition would be setting in for many families. Not enough food, and what food exists lacks variety. Bread and porridge and not much else. Vitamins are scarce. Scurvy starts to appear. Dysentery from contaminated water. People get sick, and when you're already weakened by cold and hunger, sickness becomes dangerous. The village priest would have been trying to provide comfort. The church's teachings offered an explanation for suffering. This was a test, or perhaps a punishment. Either way, faith would see you through. The promise of an afterlife, better than this earthly existence, became more appealing when earthly existence was so difficult. But the priest was human too. He was cold and hungry like everyone else. He saw his parishioners dying and couldn't stop it. Some villages had access to charitable relief. Parish priests and nuns organized what help they could. If the village had a granary with some supplies, those might be distributed. But many villages didn't have reserves. The monks in the monasteries tried to help, but their stores were limited too. And as winter dragged on, as February turned to March, and the cold refused to break, the death toll climbed. Contemporary records are difficult to interpret. How many people died? We know approximately 600,000 in France by the end of 1710, 3% of the kingdom's population. But that number is compiled from parish records, burial registers, estimates, and calculations made long after the fact. The real human cost is harder to measure. Whole families found frozen to death in their cottages. Children who died of hunger and were buried in shallow graves, or not buried at all because the ground was too frozen. The elderly and the weak who succumbed to cold or disease. And beyond the deaths, the suffering, the fear, the helplessness, the slow realization that you might not survive this. Imagine being a parent in that situation, watching your children go hungry, knowing that the food is running out and there's nothing you can do. Making impossible choices. Do you eat today so you have strength to search for more food tomorrow? Or do you give your portion to your children? Do you burn the last of the furniture to keep the fire going one more day? Or do you save it, hoping the cold will break soon? Do you trust your neighbors? Share what little you have? Or do you hoard everything because your family comes first? There are no good answers. But people endured. Somehow, many of them endured. Let's talk about how. First, the small practical adaptations. Peasants were experts at survival. They'd been doing it for generations. They knew how to make do with very little. Clothing became crucial. Wool was everything. 20 pounds of wool clothing per family, and some historians estimate, layers upon layers. A chemise next to the skin, a tunic over that, a cloak on top, hose for the legs, mittens stuffed with moss, rabbit fur, cat hair, anything that might add warmth. And you didn't wash it, not in winter. Wet wool could kill you. The houses were adapted too. About 40% of northern European peasant homes were partially underground, built into hillsides or dug into the earth. The ground temperature, even a few feet down, stays relatively constant, around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not warm, but it's warmer than the air above. The doors were positioned away from prevailing winds. The roofs were thick, layers of thatch and straw and sometimes turf, with grass roots holding it together. Every gap was stuffed. Mud and straw and dung became insulation, and people slept together in piles, sharing body heat. The remaining animals, if any survived, were brought as close as possible. Food became a constant obsession. When the stored vegetables were gone, people ate whatever they could find. Grass, if they could dig it out from under the snow. Bark from trees. Roots. Anything remotely edible went into the pot. There are records of people eating spoiled food, carrion, things that would normally be considered dangerous or disgusting. But when you're starving, those considerations matter less. Disease followed, of course. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The contaminated water, the spoiled food, the weakened bodies. People who survived the cold and the hunger sometimes died from disease in the months that followed. But some families had made better preparations. The ones who'd had a good harvest the year before, who'd managed to store more grain, more vegetables, who had a few pigs or chickens that somehow survived, they had a slightly better chance. And there was trade, when possible. If you had something someone else wanted, you could barter. A tool for some food, labor for shelter, skills for supplies. The village blacksmith, if he had survived, could trade repairs for whatever people could offer. The women who knew how to spin and weave could make cloth. The men who knew carpentry could fix things. Not everyone had skills to trade, of course. The poorest, the landless laborers who depended on seasonal work, had the least to offer and the hardest time surviving. Communities found ways to share burdens. If one cottage had a working hearth and fuel, neighbors might gather there for warmth during the day. If someone managed to hunt or trap something, the meat might be divided. The strong helped the weak when they could, though the strong themselves were often weak by this point. There's a kind of solidarity that emerges in desperate circumstances. Not always, and not universally. People are still people, with all their selfishness and cruelty. But sometimes, faced with a common enemy, whether it's an invading army or a catastrophic winter, communities pull together. The village meetings continued. Decisions made together about how to use common resources. The common lands, the pastures and forests that belong to everyone, how to manage them. Though by March, there wasn't much to manage. The forests were stripped of dead wood. The pastures were buried in snow. And still, the cold continued. March arrived, and the frost didn't break. This should have been the time when winter started loosening its grip, when the first signs of spring appeared, when farmers began preparing for planting season. But the ground was frozen more than a meter deep. Even if they'd had seed, which many didn't, they couldn't plant it. The spring planting was missed entirely in many regions, and that meant next year's harvest was lost before it even began. The realization must have been crushing. Wah. You've survived the winter, barely. You've lost loved ones. You've suffered. But at least there was hope that when spring came, things would get better. Except now, spring isn't coming. And even when it eventually does, there will be no crop. Which means next winter will be just as bad. Possibly worse. Finally, in early April, the temperature began to rise. Slowly at first, then more quickly. The ice started to melt, and the flooding began. All that frozen water, more than a meter thick in places, started turning to liquid. The ground, still frozen deep down, couldn't absorb it. Rivers overflowed their banks. Low-lying areas were inundated. Roads became impassable again, this time from water instead of snow. And the water was contaminated. Months of human and animal waste, of spoiled food, of dead bodies, all of it began washing downstream. The diseases that followed the thaw were almost as deadly as the cold had been. Dysentery spread rapidly. Scurvy affected those who'd survived on limited diets. Smallpox, measles, typhoid. People who had endured 3 months of freezing temperatures, who had fought through starvation and suffering, died in the spring from disease. By summer, the true extent of the catastrophe became clear. The crops had failed entirely. In some regions, the autumn plantings from 1708 were destroyed by the frost. The spring plantings in 1709 never happened, and the summer growing season couldn't make up for those losses. Grain prices continued to rise. Bread became scarce. France saw riots throughout the summer. People attacking granaries, bakeries, anyone suspected of hoarding food. The government tried to maintain order, but it was difficult. The War of the Spanish Succession was still ongoing. Resources were stretched thin. Other parts of Europe fared somewhat better, but everywhere felt the effects. In England, the economic impact was severe. GDP fell by 23%, on the worst economic contraction in recorded history up to that point. It would take a decade for the economy to recover. But recover it did, eventually. The winter of 1709 to 1710 was harsh too, though not as severe as the year before. And then conditions began to improve. The summers were warmer. The harvests gradually recovered. The worst was over. By the 1720s, Europe had largely returned to normal. The population deficits were slowly filled. The economy stabilized. Life went on. As it always does. What happened to our peasant family? The ones we've been imagining in their small cottage? Trying to survive? We don't know, of course. They're fictional representatives of millions of real people whose individual stories were never recorded. But we can imagine possibilities. Maybe they made it through. Maybe their preparations were just enough. Maybe they got help from neighbors, from the church, from somewhere. Maybe they made hard choices that kept them alive. Maybe they lost some family members, but not all. A grandparent, perhaps, already weakened by age. A youngest child, most vulnerable to cold and hunger. These were the usual patterns. The very young and very old died first. Maybe by 1711, 1712, they were rebuilding, replanting their field, getting new animals, slowly, painfully, returning to the rhythms they'd known before. Or maybe they didn't survive. Maybe they were among the 600,000 dead. Maybe their cottage stood empty by spring, another casualty of the coldest winter in 500 years. We can't know their specific fate, but we know that enough families did survive to keep their communities going, to pass down stories, to raise the next generation. The villages endured. The traditions continued. Life, in all its hardship and beauty, persisted. Looking back across 3 centuries, what strikes me most isn't just the suffering, though that was immense. It's the resilience. These were people with no weather forecasting, no emergency services, no global relief efforts, no grocery stores to fall back on, no central heating, no modern medicine, no social safety net beyond what they could create for themselves. They lived lives that were already difficult by our standards, lives of constant labor, limited rights, heavy obligations. And then they faced a catastrophe that would challenge any society, any time period. And many of them survived, not through individual heroism, not through grand gestures or brilliant innovations, through small daily acts of endurance, through sharing what little they had, through adaptation and cooperation, through sheer, stubborn refusal to give up, through faith, whether in God or in each other, or simply in the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The Great Frost of 1709 has been largely forgotten. It doesn't have the dramatic narrative of a war or a plague. There's no single villain to blame. I've seen no clear beginning or end to the story. It was just winter. A terrible, catastrophic winter, but still just weather. And yet it changed Europe. 600,000 dead in France alone. Possibly 1 million across the continent. The economic impact lasted years. The political consequences, the weakening of Sweden and the rise of Russia, the pressures on France during wartime, all of that rippled through history. And on a smaller scale, in countless villages, it changed individual lives forever. The survivors carried those memories, the stories passed down through generations, the preparations made for future winters, because you never knew when another catastrophe might strike. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your heated home, with food in your kitchen and water from your tap, it might be worth remembering those peasant families, not to feel guilty, not to minimize current struggles, because every age has its challenges, but just to remember, to hold a quiet appreciation for the things we take for granted, to acknowledge the incredible hardship that people endured and the strength they showed in enduring it, to recognize that we are connected to them across the centuries. Their descendants are our ancestors. Their struggles made possible the world we inherited. And perhaps most importantly, to remember that humans are remarkably resilient. When faced with impossible circumstances, people find ways to adapt, to survive, to help each other, to keep going. Not everyone makes it. Many don't. But enough do. Enough to rebuild, to replant, to start again. The fire in the cottage hearth has burned low now. The family, huddled together under their wool blankets, begins to drift into sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. There's never a guarantee of survival. The cold still grips the land. The stores are still running low. But tonight, they're alive. They've made it through another day. And that, in the winter of 1709, was enough. Outside, the stars are sharp and clear in the frozen sky. The village is quiet, smoke rising from a handful of cottages. The fields lie buried under snow. Everything is still. And in that stillness, there's a kind of peace. Not comfort, exactly, but the peace that comes from endurance, from knowing that you've done everything you could, that you've survived this far. That morning will come, as it always does, and with morning, another chance. Sleep now. Let yourself drift, warm in your bed, safe from the frost. The story of 1709 is over. The people are gone, but their strength remains, their quiet resilience, their refusal to surrender to the cold. Rest now, and remember them, the forgotten winter, the forgotten people who survived the impossible and lived to see spring come again. But wait, there's more to this story, more quiet moments worth remembering, more details of how people actually lived through those months. Let me take you deeper into that winter. Think about the texture of daily life during the frost, the way time moves differently when you're in survival mode. Days blur together. One frozen morning looks much like the last. The same struggles, the same small victories, the same losses. But within that repetition, there are moments. A child's laugh, brief and unexpected, breaking the somber mood. A neighbor arriving with a handful of dried peas to share, saying they had extra. Both of you knowing that's not quite true, but accepting the gift anyway, because pride matters less than hunger. The satisfaction of getting the fire started quickly, of not having to struggle with damp wood and weak sparks. Small things. They're what keep you going when the large things, the future, the harvest, the next season, are too overwhelming to think about. Let's talk about the women. History often focuses on kings and nobles, wars and politics. Even when we talk about peasants, we often default to talking about the peasant as though there's one universal experience. But women's experiences during the Great Frost had their own particular character. Women were responsible for maintaining the household, cooking, spinning, weaving, tending the garden, caring for children, fetching water, managing the small livestock like chickens and geese. When the frost hit, those responsibilities became exponentially harder. Water, normally carried from the well or stream, was now frozen. You had to break ice, melt snow, ration every drop. The spinning and weaving, normally done in spare moments throughout the day, became crucial for survival. Wool needed to be processed into thread, thread into fabric, fabric into clothing and blankets. The work was endless, and your fingers were always cold. The children needed constant attention. Keeping them near the fire, making sure they didn't go outside unprepared, and stretching the food to give them adequate portions while going hungry yourself. And the cooking, With limited ingredients and limited fuel, how do you feed a family? The stew pot became the center of everything. You'd put it over the fire in the morning. Add whatever you had. Barley, maybe. Some dried peas. A scrap of salted pork if you were fortunate. Herbs if you'd managed to dry some the previous summer. Then you'd let it simmer all day, adding water as needed, adding anything else that became available. By evening, you'd have something. A thick, warm porridge stew that would fill stomachs even if it didn't fully nourish. The same pot, often unwashed, would be used day after day. The flavors building on each other, the residue from one meal flavoring the next. It wasn't about taste. It was about calories, about warmth, about survival. And there were decisions only women could make. If there's not enough food, who eats? The men, because they need strength for whatever labor is still possible? The children, because they're most vulnerable? Yourself, because you can't care for everyone else if you collapse from weakness? There's no good answer. Every choice carries guilt. You feed your children and watch your husband weaken. You feed your husband and watch your children go hungry. You feed yourself and feel like a monster. So you do what you can. You stretch everything a little further. You water the stew more. You cut the bread thinner. You go to bed hungry so someone else can eat a little more. And you don't talk about it. You don't complain. Because complaining won't change anything. The men had their own struggles. The work of farming, of maintaining the Lord's land in your own plot that had defined male peasant life, was largely impossible. The ground was frozen. The tools were useless against it. So what do you do when the work that's defined your entire life becomes impossible? You find other work, gathering firewood, though every tree for miles has been stripped already. Hunting, though the game is scarce and dying. Repairing things, the cottage walls, the roof, the tools for when they'll be needed again. Protecting the family. From cold, from hunger, from wolves that were getting bolder. But there's a helplessness that comes with being unable to provide. Your family is hungry, and you can't feed them. Your children are cold, and you can't warm them. Your wife is exhausted, and you can't ease her burden. The social contract that said if you work hard, if you fulfill your obligations, your family will be okay, has failed, and you feel that failure personally, even though it's not your fault, even though everyone is in the same situation, it still feels like failure. Some men coped by leaving and joining the bands of desperate people roaming the countryside, looking for food, for work, for anything. Some never came back. Others returned weeks or months later, having found nothing, having made the situation worse by leaving. A few, very few, found something. A lord who still had stores and was hiring guards, a monastery with charity to distribute, a town where there was work. But those were rare. Mostly, you stayed. You endured. You tried to maintain dignity in an undignified situation. Let's talk about the children for a moment, because they're often the ones we think about least. But they were there, experiencing this too. A child of 5 or 6 in 1709 wouldn't fully understand what was happening. They'd know it was cold. They'd know they were hungry. They'd know the adults were worried. But the larger context, the historical significance, the scope of the disaster would be beyond them. They'd adapt in the way children do, playing quieter games because there's no energy for running and shouting, staying close to the fire because everywhere else is too cold, accepting smaller meals without complaint because they sense this is serious. Older children, 10 or 12, would understand more. They'd see the fear in their parents' eyes. They'd count the remaining food and know it won't last. They'd hear the stories of people dying in nearby villages, and they'd try to help, fetching what little water there was, watching younger siblings, going without food so others could eat, growing up faster than they should have to. Some children didn't make it. The very young were most vulnerable. Their small bodies couldn't handle the cold, the malnutrition, the disease. Parents would wake to find a child who'd been sleeping between them, using their body heat for warmth, had simply not woken up. Hypothermia maybe, or malnutrition, or some sickness that a healthy body could fight off, but a weakened one couldn't. There would be grief, of course, but also a terrible, guilty relief. One less mouth to feed, better chance for the others to survive. Those are the thoughts you can't say out loud. The ones that haunt you later. The older generation, the grandparents, if they'd lived that long, often chose to sacrifice themselves, eating less so the younger generation could eat more, giving up their place by the fire, sometimes wandering off into the snow, never to return. A final act of love, reducing the number of people the family had to support. In medieval society, the elderly had value, their knowledge, their experience, their role in passing down traditions. But in extreme circumstances, pragmatism took over, and they knew it. They'd lived through other hard times. They understood what needed to happen, so they made their choice quietly, and the family mourned, but accepted it, because what else could they do? The village priest played a complex role during these months. On one hand, he was a source of spiritual comfort. The church taught that suffering had meaning, that this life was temporary, a test before eternal life, that endurance would be rewarded, that God had a plan, even if we couldn't see it. For some people, that was genuinely comforting. It gave a framework for understanding the incomprehensible. It provided hope beyond the immediate circumstances. But the priest was also a representative of an institution that demanded tithes even when people were starving. That had wealth and land while peasants died. That spoke of divine will while sitting in slightly warmer buildings with slightly fuller stomachs. Some priests were genuinely holy men who suffered alongside their parishioners, who gave away everything they had, who worked tirelessly to provide what comfort they could. Others were less admirable. Humans in positions of power often are. But the church building itself remained important. A place to gather, a place to mark the passage of time with familiar rituals, a place to baptize the few babies still being born, to marry the optimistic young couples, to bury the increasing dead. The church calendar continued. Feast days and saints' days and holy days, Though the feasts were meager or non-existent, the celebrations muted, the prayers more desperate. There's a particular kind of waiting that happens in situations like this. You're waiting for something to change, for the temperature to rise, for supplies to arrive, for anything to break the monotony of survival. But nothing changes. Day after day, week after week, the same cold, the same hunger, the same fear. And you realize that waiting is pointless. This is just life now. There's no rescue coming, no sudden salvation, just the daily grind of staying alive. So you stop waiting and start existing. You find a rhythm. Wake. Tend the fire. Eat what little there is. Do what work is possible. Huddle together. Sleep. Repeat. It's not living exactly, but it's not dying either. It's something in between. Survival in its most basic form. Late February brought a shift, subtle but noticeable. Not in temperature. That remained brutally cold, but in the mindset of those who had made it this far. The weakest had already died. The ones who remained were, by definition, the stronger ones, or the luckier ones, or just the ones whose circumstances had been slightly less dire. There was a kind of grim determination that set in. We've made it this far. We can make it further. Spring will come eventually. It has to. That determination didn't make the cold easier to bear, didn't fill empty stomachs or bring back the dead, but it provided something to hold on to, a defiant refusal to give up. The nights were when things got hardest, some. During the day, there was activity, things to do, however limited. But at night, huddled under insufficient blankets, listening to the wind howling outside, feeling the cold seeping through every gap in the walls, there was nothing but your thoughts. And your thoughts, in those circumstances, are rarely kind. You think about the people you've lost. You worry about the people who remain. You wonder how much longer you can keep going. You calculate the remaining food against the remaining days until spring, and the math doesn't work. You listen to your children breathing and pray they'll still be breathing in the morning. You feel the hunger gnawing at your stomach and try to ignore it. You drift in and out of sleep, never quite comfortable, never quite warm enough. Morning always came as a relief, even though morning just meant another day of the same struggles. At least it was something to do. March arrived and the cold finally began to ease. Slowly at first, a few degrees warmer, barely noticeable, but after 3 months of unrelenting frost, any change was significant. The ice on the rivers started to crack. The snow began to melt just slightly. You could feel it in the air. A subtle shift. The promise of spring, still distant but approaching. Hope, dangerous but irresistible, began to emerge. Maybe we'll survive this after all. Maybe the worst is over. Maybe there's a future beyond this endless winter. But with the thaw came new challenges. All that ice, all that snow melting at once. The ground was still frozen deep down, unable to absorb the water. Rivers overflowed. Low areas flooded. The roads, already impassable from snow, became impassable from mud and water, and the floodwater carried death with it. Months of accumulated waste, animal carcasses, human bodies that had frozen where they fell, all of it washing downstream, contaminating wells and streams, spreading disease. Dysentery swept through villages that had survived the frost. Typhoid followed, cholera in some areas. The people who'd endured 3 months of freezing temperatures, who'd fought through starvation, now faced illness. And their weakened bodies had little resistance. More died in April and May than had died in February. A bitter irony. Surviving the worst only to fall to the aftermath. By summer, the full scope of the disaster was clear. The harvest was lost, not just reduced, lost entirely in many regions. The autumn planting from 1708 had frozen in the ground. The spring planting in 1709 had never happened, and the summer crops couldn't compensate. Next winter would bring famine again. Less severe than the frost, probably, but severe enough. The cycle of suffering would continue for another year, maybe 2. Yet people planted anyway. Those who had survived, who still had land, who could get seed somehow. They went out into their fields and they planted, not because they expected a full harvest, but because what else do you do? You're a farmer. You plant. That's the rhythm of life. Spring comes, you plant. Summer comes, you tend. Autumn comes, you harvest. Winter comes, you survive. And then spring comes again. The frost had disrupted that rhythm catastrophically, but the rhythm itself remained. A kind of faith, not necessarily in God, though that too, but in the land, in the seasons, in the basic patterns of life. You plant because that's what you do. And maybe this time it will work. Maybe this time there will be enough. Some families left their villages, left their land, left everything they'd known, became refugees, wandering in search of somewhere better, or at least somewhere different. Some went to cities, hoping for work. Others went to different regions, rumors of places less affected by the frost. A few left Europe entirely. The German Palatines, facing impossible conditions, emigrated in large numbers. Starting over somewhere new seemed better than slowly dying somewhere familiar. Most of those who left probably didn't survive either. The roads were dangerous. Disease was everywhere. The food was scarce in all regions. But at least they were doing something, taking action instead of passively enduring. For some people, that choice, that agency, mattered more than the likely outcome. The ones who stayed, who kept their land, who maintained their place in the village, they were making a choice too. A choice to trust in what they knew, to believe that this place, this land, this community would recover. And slowly, painfully, it did. The summer of 1709 was warmer, then the winter had been cold. Not a great harvest, but something. Enough to give hope. The winter of 1709 to 1710 was difficult but survivable. By 1711, things were noticeably better. By 1712, almost normal. The scars remained. The population was reduced. Many villages never fully recovered. But life went on. Babies were born. Couples married. Fields were planted and harvested. The rhythm resumed. Looking back, what's remarkable isn't just that people survived. It's that society survived. The feudal system, already under strain, endured. The church, despite its failures to protect its flock, maintained its authority. The villages, devastated as they were, continued to exist. You might expect that kind of catastrophe to break everything, to spark revolutions, to fundamentally change the social order. And there were changes, subtle ones. But mostly, things returned to how they'd been before. Because what's the alternative? Tearing down the whole system when you're still struggling to survive? When you need stability more than justice? People chose continuity over chaos, not because the system was good, but because it was familiar. And familiar was easier than unknown. Our peasant family, if they survived, would have resumed their old routines, working the Lord's land, paying their tithes, raising their children, preparing for next winter. Always preparing for next winter. Because now, they knew what could happen. They'd store more food if possible. They'd gather more firewood. They'd stuff more gaps in the cottage walls. They'd be ready. Though, of course, if another frost, like 1709 came, being ready wouldn't matter much. But the act of preparing gave comfort, a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. The children who survived would carry the memory of that winter forever. They'd tell their own children about it someday, about the year the world froze, about how cold it was, how hungry they were, how scared, about the people who died, about the strength it took to survive. And those children would tell their children, and the story would pass down through generations, becoming family history, becoming village legend, eventually becoming a footnote in the history books. The Great Frost of 1709. A few paragraphs, some statistics, a brief mention of political consequences, rarely focusing on the individual human cost, on families like ours, struggling and surviving, on the daily acts of courage and sacrifice, on the quiet endurance that defines most human experience. Which brings us back to tonight, to you, listening to this story, warm and safe. The Great Frost happened 316 years ago. Everyone who experienced it is long dead. The cottages have crumbled. The villages have changed or disappeared. The fields have been farmed by countless generations since. But the human capacity for endurance remains. The ability to face impossible circumstances and keep going, to make hard choices, to sacrifice for others, to find meaning in survival. That hasn't changed. We still have that strength, even if we rarely need to use it, even if we hope we never have to. And knowing that humans can survive the unsurvivable, there's comfort in that. A reminder that whatever challenges we face, however insurmountable they seem, we have the capacity to endure, not always successfully, not always without loss, but we endure, we persist, we survive, and eventually, if we're fortunate, we thrive again. The fire in the cottage has gone out now, just ashes and the ghost of warmth, but morning will come. as it always does, and with morning, the chance to rebuild the fire, to start again, to keep going. That's the lesson of 1709, if there is one. Not that suffering is noble, not that hardship builds character, just that humans persist. Against cold and hunger and loss and despair, we persist. So sleep now. Let the story fade. Let yourself drift into rest. The frost is 3 centuries past. The winter is over. Spring came, as it always does, and life continued, as it always does. Rest. Be warm. Be safe. And remember, when you wake tomorrow, that you carry within you the same strength those peasants had, the same capacity to endure. You probably won't need it, but it's there, always there, waiting. But before we end, let's linger a little longer in that world. There are still details worth noticing, still moments worth preserving. Think about the sounds of that winter. We talk about the cold, the hunger, the suffering. But what did it sound like? In the depths of winter, with snow covering everything, sound becomes muffled. The usual background noise of village life, footsteps on dirt paths, animals moving about, people calling to each other. All of that was dampened or absent. What remained was silence mostly. The occasional crack of a tree splitting in the cold. The wind, constant and bitter. The crackle of fire in those cottages that still had fuel. Coughing from smoke-filled rooms. Quiet crying from hungry children. Whispered prayers. The village that had been full of life and noise became a place of muted suffering. Even the church bells, when they were rung, sometimes cracked from the extreme cold. The sound of those fractured bells must have seemed ominous, a physical manifestation of something breaking. And the smells. Smoke was everywhere. Every cottage with a fire produced smoke, and with poor ventilation, it filled the rooms. Your clothes smelled of smoke, your hair, your skin, but also the smell of unwashed bodies. Bathing in winter was always minimal, but during the frost, it became nearly impossible. Water had to be melted from snow or ice. Fuel was precious. Wet skin in cold air was dangerous, so people didn't wash. For months. The smell must have been overwhelming by our standards, but probably barely noticed by theirs, because everyone was in the same situation. And underneath it all, the smell of sickness, of spoiled food, of death, in some cottages. These are uncomfortable realities, but they were part of the experience, part of what made survival so difficult. The days had a particular quality of light during those months. Winter days are short anywhere in northern Europe, but during the frost, with thick cloud cover much of the time, with the sun weak even when visible, the light was thin and gray. Dawn came late, dusk came early, and in between, a pale daylight that barely penetrated the small windows of peasant cottages. Most of life happened in dimness. By firelight at night, if you had fire, by the weak winter sun during the day, filtering through oiled cloth or shuttered windows. Candles were expensive, made from tallow or beeswax, used sparingly, if at all. So people lived in a kind of perpetual twilight, which must have affected mood, energy, everything. Seasonal depression wasn't understood then, but it was still real. The lack of light, combined with the cold and hunger, must have created a particular kind of psychological weight. And yet, there were still moments of beauty. This seems almost wrong to say, given the suffering, but beauty doesn't stop existing just because circumstances are dire. The frost created landscapes of stunning visual drama, trees encased in ice, every branch crystalline, rivers frozen into sculptural forms, snow drifted into patterns by the wind, icicles hanging from eaves, catching what little sunlight there was. Did anyone notice? Did anyone have the capacity to appreciate beauty when they were struggling to survive? Probably not consciously, but maybe sometimes. A child looking at frost patterns on a window, a woman pausing for just a moment to watch her breath fog in the cold air, a man noticing how the bare trees stood stark against a pale sky. Brief moments, not enough to outweigh the hardship, but there, nonetheless. Reminders that the world continues to be the world, that beauty exists alongside suffering, that both are real. The animals that survived had their own struggles. We've talked about the livestock dying, but some endured. A cow, somehow still alive, producing a little milk. Chickens, hardy survivors, still occasionally laying eggs. A dog, thin and hungry, still loyal to the family. These animals were valuable beyond measure. The cow's milk might keep children alive. The eggs were treasured, divided carefully among the family. The dog provided warmth at night, companionship, and perhaps a bit of security. People and animals had always lived closely together. But during the frost, that relationship deepened. Mutual dependence. The animals needed the humans for whatever shelter and food could be provided. The humans needed the animals for warmth, for food, for the psychological comfort of another living presence. When an animal died, it was a loss on multiple levels. Practical, certainly, but also emotional. A companion gone, a source of comfort eliminated. Another failure in your duty to protect those depending on you. On some families made impossible choices about their animals. If the cow is starving, do you feed it your last bit of hay, hoping it survives to produce milk again? Or do you slaughter it now, knowing you'll have meat for a few weeks but nothing after? If the dog is hungry, do you share your food with it? Or do you accept that the dog might die, conserving resources for the humans? These decisions, made privately, carried weight. There was no good answer. Every choice sacrificed something, and you had to live with the consequences. The social dynamics within families must have been complex. Marriages strained by constant stress, siblings competing for limited resources, parents making choices about which children got the most food, the strong, healthy children who had better chances of surviving, or the weak ones who needed it most. Families pulled together, but they also sometimes fractured. Arguments over nothing and everything. Blame assigned, deserved or not. Old resentments surfacing. In normal times, you could escape tension by going outside, working in the fields, visiting neighbors. But during the frost, everyone was trapped together, in one small room, for months. The intimacy of that confinement must have been suffocating sometimes, and yet there must have been tenderness too. A mother stroking her child's hair as they fell asleep. A father wrapping his cloak around his whole family. Siblings huddled together for warmth. Bickering forgotten in the shared need. Grandparents telling stories to distract from hunger. Small acts of love, made more precious by being all you had to give. You couldn't provide safety, or abundance, or comfort, but you could provide presence, your physical warmth, your attention, your care. That might be the most human thing, to continue showing love even when you can't protect the ones you love, to keep trying even when trying seems futile. let's think about faith for a moment. Not the institutional church, which we've discussed, but personal faith, the private relationship between an individual and God. For many medieval peasants, God was as real as the cold. Prayer wasn't just ritual, it was conversation, asking for help, expressing fear, seeking comfort. During the frost, how did faith hold up? For some, it probably strengthened. This is a test. God wouldn't give more than we can bear. There's purpose in suffering. Those thoughts, whether true or not, provided structure, a way to make sense of the senseless. For others, faith probably wavered. If God is good and all-powerful, why this? Why the suffering of innocents? Why the death of children? Those are old questions asked in every age, but they become sharper when you're living them. Some people probably lost their faith entirely. Not dramatically, not with declarations, just a quiet erosion. Prayers that went unanswered too many times, promises that seemed broken, hope that faded. Others found different ways to believe. Maybe God didn't cause the frost. Maybe this was just nature. But God was present anyway, in the strength to endure, in the neighbor who shared food, in the child who survived, in the spring that eventually came. The community rituals mattered more during crisis. Gathering at the church, even when it was almost too cold. Observing the holy days, even when there was nothing to celebrate. Maintaining the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. These acts affirmed that the world still had order. That despite the chaos of the frost, some things remained constant. Sunday still came. Saints' days still marked the passage of time. The structure of religious life continued. And that continuity was psychologically important. It said, "This will end. Life will return to normal. We will survive." Even if you didn't quite believe it, acting as if you did helped. There were moments of grace scattered through the suffering. A day slightly warmer than the others, a discovery of food that had been overlooked. A child's recovery from illness, a neighbor's unexpected kindness. Small mercies, easily missed, but noticed and remembered because they stood out against the backdrop of hardship. Those moments didn't erase the suffering, but they punctuated it, created breathing space, reminded people that good still existed, that life wasn't only darkness, and there was dark humor, probably. Humans make jokes even in terrible circumstances, maybe especially in terrible circumstances. Humor as a coping mechanism, as a small rebellion against despair. We don't have records of the jokes peasants told during the frost, but they probably existed. Gallows humor about the cold, the hunger, the absurdity of it all. Laughing because the alternative was crying. And you can only cry so much before you're empty. By the time April arrived and the thaw really began, the survivors were changed. Not in obvious ways, necessarily. They looked the same, more or less. Thinner, perhaps, more worn. But internally, they were different. They'd seen the worst of what life could offer. They'd made impossible choices. They'd lost people they loved. They'd endured. And that endurance changed them. Some became harder, more cynical, less trusting of God or fate or the future. Others became softer, more appreciative of small things, more connected to community. Most probably became some combination, carrying both the trauma and the strength, both the loss and the gratitude for what remained. The children who survived would grow up with the frost as a defining memory. It would shape how they viewed the world, how they prepared for winter, how they thought about risk and security, how they parented their own children. Trauma passes through generations in subtle ways. The grandson of a frost survivor might not remember the frost itself, but he'd inherit the caution, the preparedness, the understanding that catastrophe can arrive without warning. And yet, life normalized surprisingly quickly. By 1715, most of Europe had recovered economically. By 1720, the population was growing again. The villages were functioning. The fields were producing. It was as if the frost had been an aberration, a terrible interruption, but just an interruption. Life resumed. People forgot or chose to forget, or simply moved on because dwelling on the past didn't help the present. That's perhaps the most remarkable thing. The human capacity not just to endure a crisis, but to move past it, to rebuild, to continue, to find joy again, even after experiencing profound suffering. So our story ends not with tragedy, though there was tragedy, not with triumph, though there was survival, but with continuity. The village continues. The seasons turn. People are born and people die. Crops are planted and harvested. Winter comes and winter goes. The great frost becomes memory, becomes story, becomes history. And life in all its ordinary complexity goes on. Now it's truly time to rest. The story is told. The winter is past. The frost has melted. Spring has come, as it always does. Let yourself settle into sleep. Let the weight of the day fall away. You're safe. You're warm. You're here. And tomorrow will bring its own moments. Not a great frost, probably. Just ordinary life. Which is enough. More than enough. Rest now. Sleep deeply. And wake refreshed. Good night.